Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to trace an absolutely phenomenal historical journey. We'll be looking at how the entire medium of storytelling has evolved, starting all the way back with ancient oral traditions and bringing it right up to modern digital media. But as we map out this history, you'll see a pretty fascinating pattern emerge. Because while the technology completely changes, our deep psychological dependency on what we call the narrative anchor remains absolutely constant.
So, to really understand where stories began, we first have to imagine the totally chaotic, incredibly ambiguous nature of early human existence. Picture early humanity facing an unpredictable, scary world. Now, ask yourself, what do we inherently do when we're faced with a massive void of information? Like, how do humans survive the silence?
Well, there's this brilliant quote by the author Reynolds Price that really hits the nail on the head. He points out that we are fundamentally storytelling organisms. We literally abhor the silence. In the absence of clear answers, we invented narratives just to connect the dots. The need for stories is so baked into us, it's essentially our second most pressing survival need, right after finding food and actually coming before finding love or shelter. The sound of a story basically became the dominant sound of our lives.
And that brings us to an absolutely crucial concept, the story vacuum. You see, whenever there's an absence of a clear narrative, especially in urgent, frightening, or just highly ambiguous situations, we actively seek out and consume plausible stories. It's like a thirsty person desperately finding water in a desert. And here is the real kicker. Once we adopt an explanatory narrative to fill up that vacuum, it becomes incredibly hard to undo. And that's true regardless of whether the story is actually factual. Okay, let's jump into section 1, the dawn of narrative. Long before we had anything resembling written text, ancient cultures had to use physical spaces to anchor their stories. Aboriginal peoples in Australia, for instance, used rock art as a genius memory aid, combining painted symbols with highly immersive music and dance to bring meaning to their world. But as these oral traditions expanded over generations, storytellers needed a way to manage massive amounts of information. And there's a staggering statistic uncovered by researcher Albert Bates Lord that kind of changes everything we thought we knew about ancient storytelling. When he studied ancient texts like Homer's Odyssey alongside modern oral bards, he discovered that these ancient storytellers weren't actually memorizing whole epics word for word. No way. Instead, fully 90% of an oral epic is built out of stockpiled set phrases. They were literally improvising these massive stories on the fly. We call these set phrases formulas. You'd probably recognize some famous ones from Homer, like the wine dark sea, or the rosy-fingered dawn. Think of them like ancient, easily memorable catchphrases. They were the highly efficient building blocks of early storytelling. Using these phrases allowed the narrator to keep the auditory flow moving really smoothly, which bought their brain a split second to mentally construct the very next event in the sequence. It was just a totally ingenious system of oral technology. But beyond those word-level formulas, ancient bards also relied on universal structural themes. You see this absolutely everywhere in folklore, often showing up as the classic rule of three. At a macro level, stories predictably move through three major steps. You've got the setup detailing the hero's world, then a confrontation that turns that entire world upside down, and finally a transformative resolution where the hero conquers. This specific structure ensured that vital knowledge was passed on in a format the human brain just naturally craves. Now, early human cultures didn't just tell stories. They actively categorized them by their perceived truthfulness. Folklorists use two distinct German terms to describe this divide. First, we have Märchen, which are basically your fairy tales. They're set in a lighthearted, nowhere-in-particular world. They aren't meant to be believed as literal fact, and the characters are pretty flat. On the flip side, we have Sagen. These are legends tied to very specific times and places. They are supposed to have actually happened. Because of that, their supernatural elements feel emotionally fraught, dark, and incredibly powerful. Moving right along to Section 2, Indigenous Storywork and Values. When we look across different indigenous tribes, we see these storytelling functions are incredibly dynamic and deeply purposeful. For the Stolo community, stories reinforce identity by intimately connecting children directly to the land. For the Navajo, stories serve as core ethical teachings. And honestly, this is my personal favorite. The Ojibwe use what's called instructional ribbing. If a child misbehaves, a caregiver might playfully warn them about a snatching owl. It's just a fantastic, non-confrontational way to playfully correct behavior and teach cooperation without resorting to direct scolding. We also see deep survival values encoded perfectly into narratives. Take an wild community in your Mexico City, for example. Their stories warn of the hawake, hostile water spirits that guard bodies of water. If a protagonist disrespects nature and breaks something belonging to the awake without replacing it, that character meets a grim fate. Right? It's an unbelievably powerful narrative tool to ensure the whole community values and protects their fragile environment. Which brings us to Section 3, the shift to stable media. As we step forward in time, we hit a massive, game-changing turning point, the emancipation of the story. We go from a fluid, collective oral effort to an authored text that is permanently locked down. Our technological journey started with the most fleeting, temporary canvases. Think drawing in the sand or on leaves. Then we moved up to rock art and living trees. But with the advent of stable, highly portable media, things like clay tablets, parchment, and eventually paper, individual authors could finally freeze their narratives. They could transport these exact, unchanging stories across the globe, which fundamentally altered our entire perception of authorship. And now we reach Section 4, the digital storytelling era. The ancient campfire hasn't disappeared at all. It's simply transformed. Today, it looks like interactive digital platforms and modern corporate boardrooms. The collaborative chatter of the ancient oral storyteller actually lives on very strongly in modern gaming. Think about traditional dice and paper role-playing games of the 1990s, or today's massive online MMORPGs. In these digital spaces, a narrator or game engine controls the environment while the players actively participate. They're driving the fictional universe forward together, exactly like ancient communities co-creating a tale around a fire. To show you just how vital this narrative anchor remains today, far beyond just entertainment, consider this number, 100,000. Right now, there are over 100,000 books, seminars, and online conversations dedicated solely to modern business networking. And guess what? At the core of almost every single one of them is the art of storytelling. In the modern business world, stories are literally currency. Prior to the 1940s, recruiting was basically just putting dry ads in a newspaper. But now, it's all about framing the ideal candidate narrative. Public relations firms exist purely to control the public narrative of an organization. Professional networkers use stories to make their expertise memorable. And managers use narrative discourse to quietly resolve workplace conflicts without direct confrontation. Across the board, storytelling is the dominant tool we use to unify groups and interpret the past. But why does it work so amazingly well, even in a modern boardroom? Well, a Nielsen study actually explains the neuroscience behind it. When you read pure, dry data, you only engage the language decoding parts of your brain. It's just processing. But when you read or hear a story, your whole brain lights up. It activates the language centers and the experiential regions of the brain. Those are the exact same areas that would fire if you were actually experiencing those events in real life. Consuming stories neurologically mimics actual life experiences, which makes them infinitely more memorable than abstract statistics. Finally, let's wrap things up with Section 5, the story vacuum today. Let's pull this whole thing together and connect it right back to the concept of the story vacuum we discussed at the very beginning. Look, our media has gone from cave walls to fiber optic cables, but our biology, it hasn't changed one bit. We are still those ancient humans, inherently terrified of the silence, constantly seeking out narratives to make sense of the chaos around us. So as you navigate the incredibly complex and often ambiguous digital media of our modern world, I want to leave you with this final thought. When you face a void of information today, what narratives are you actively adopting to make sense of the silence? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the stories around you.